The woman in the garden, the sky was gray and the wind was cold and the ground was wet with last night's rain, and he stood alone in his garden, holding a small hose, watering the plants that somehow still grew in this broken world. He liked the quiet. And the silence helped him forget the war and the screaming and the loss and the fire, and the noise that never left his head even after years of peace, or what people now called peace. He was not expecting anyone that day, and no one ever came this far from the city, because the land was empty and the roads were cracked and nothing lived out here except old memories and birds who had forgotten how to sing. Then he saw her. She was walking through the trees like a shadow, like a ghost, like a figure from a dream or a nightmare, her clothes torn, her hair wet, her feet bare, her arms shaking, and in her hands she held something small, something wrapped in a dirty cloth, something that made no sound. He stepped back and stared, and she stepped forward. And then she collapsed. She fell near the roses, and the water kept pouring from the hose, and the child in her arms rolled into the dirt and still did not cry. He ran to her, and his heart was loud in his chest, and he bent down and turned her over. And her lips moved, but her eyes stayed closed, and she looked more dead than alive. Please, she whispered, and her voice was like broken glass. Please do not let them take her. And then she passed out. He picked up the child first, because the child was so still and so light, like holding smoke, and he felt fear because the child looked up at him with eyes that were not right, not human, not normal. The eyes were silver and deep like metal lakes, and he saw himself in those eyes, and he felt something move in his mind like a soft whisper, a thought that was not his own. He shook his head and carried the woman inside and laid her on the old couch and covered her with a blanket and placed the child next to her and tried not to look at the strange eyes. Again he boiled water and made tea and checked her pulse and cleaned the dirt from her face, and she looked young but tired, and her skin was cold, and her hands had cuts and bruises, and her feet were bleeding from walking too far. He did not know who she was, but she was not from here, and he was sure of that because no one came here, and no one brought a child, and no one had eyes like that child. Sun was going down, and he sat by the window and watched the forest, and he thought about the war and the stories he had heard near the end about secret missions and missing children and soldiers who never returned. He looked at the child again, and she stared at him without blinking, and then she smiled just a little, and he felt the air in the room get warmer, like something invisible had just arrived or something hidden had just woken up. He checked the woman again, and this time she opened her eyes just a little, and she looked at him like she remembered something, and her lips moved again, but no sound came out, and then her hand reached for his and held tight and shook. They are coming, she said, and this time he heard it clearly. They are coming for her, and they will not stop, and you have to hide her, and you have to protect her. He nodded without thinking, and she smiled a little and let go and fell asleep again, like her body had given up everything just to say those words outside. The trees moved again, and not from the wind, and he stood up and looked through the window and saw shadows between the trunks, tall and slow and heavy. He turned off the lights and locked the doors and picked up the child, and her skin was warm like sunlight, and her heartbeat was fast like a bird, and he felt her fingers wrap around his thumb and not let go. The night came fast, and the silence was gone, and the birds were gone, and the air smelled like metal, and the stars were gone too, and the house felt smaller than before. He sat in the dark with the child in his arms and a woman on his couch, and something dangerous in the woods, and no idea what would happen next, but he remembered her words, do not let them take her, and he knew he would not. Whatever they were, whoever they were, they've to come through him. Who are they? The night was deep and heavy like a thick blanket over the world, and he sat with the child in his arms, listening to the silence that was not really silence at all. There were soft sounds outside, soft cracks, soft movements, like something breathing in the dark, like something walking without shoes, like something with a purpose. The woman on the couch stirred and opened her eyes and looked at him with fear and memory and sadness. They are close, she said, and her voice was dry like dust, and they do not stop, and they never forget, and if they find her, they will take her, and no one will see her again. He asked, who are they? And she shook her head slowly and said, not human, not alien, something in between, something made for hunting, something made to track, something that knows how to smell fear. She coughed and sat up with great effort and looked around the small house. and her eyes stayed on the door and the windows and the corners like she expected the walls to vanish. She said they used to look like monsters now. They look like men and women and children and anything else they need to be, and you cannot trust your eyes anymore because they have learned to lie. He asked about the child, and she placed her hand on the girl's head and said she is not normal, she is not one of them, but she is not fully human either. And that is why they want her, because she is something new, something they cannot control, something they fear. He felt a chill in his spine and looked down at the child who now slept peacefully in his lap with her silver eyes closed and her fingers still wrapped around his shirt, like she knew he was the only one left between her and the dark. Woman stood and staggered to the window and pulled the curtain just a little and looked outside and whispered that they were here now and they had found them and it was too late to run. He moved fast and locked the back door and grabbed the old rifle from under the table and the batteries for the emergency lamp and placed the child in a box with soft cloth and covered her gently. Then there was a knock, a soft one, just 3 taps. He waited and the knock came again, but this time louder and slower, like whoever was outside wanted to remind him that they had time and he did know. Whispered to the woman and asked if she had any weapons, and she said no, because weapons do not work on them. Not unless you know what they are, not unless you see the truth. The knock came a 3rd time, and now there was a voice, a man's voice, clear and calm. Hello, sir, I am from the Border Patrol, and we saw some movement near your land, and we just want to ask a few questions. He did not answer. The voice came again, a little closer. We are looking for a woman and a child, and we think they may be in danger, and if you know anything, we would be very grateful for your help. The woman was shaking, and her lips moved without sound, and her eyes were wide like the walls were closing in, and her fingers pressed into the windowsill like claws. He stepped to the door and said nothing. The voice outside changed. It was still calm but colder now and less human. Sir, we need you to open the door now, or we will be forced to enter, and we really do not want to do that. The woman grabbed his arm and whispered, they do not knock when they are sure. They knock when they are testing, when they are playing, when they are feeding on fear. He asked how many, and she said she did not know, because they hide inside faces and they hide inside voices, and they never come alone. He held the rifle tight and turned on the emergency lamp, and the light was blue and sharp and showed the dust in the air and the sweat on his hands. The door shook just a little, like someone had pushed it gently with one finger. Then the voice said, one last thing, the child belongs to us. And then it was quiet again. The woman screamed and fell to the floor and held her head and said they were inside her mind and they were pulling memories and burning them and laughing without mouths. He closed his eyes and breathed and tried to think of the old war, the old rules, the old enemies, and the old tricks, because maybe something old could stop something new. The child opened her eyes and they were glowing now. Not silver, but white like stars, and her skin gave off light, and he felt warm and afraid and hopeful all at once. She looked at the door, and it unlocked by itself and opened slowly, and there was nothing on the other side, just darkness and footsteps coming closer. He held the rifle and stepped forward and said one thing to the woman, take the child and hide. She nodded and crawled to the box and held the glowing child and vanished into the back room. The man took a deep breath and pointed the rifle at the dark and said, come and get me. In the dark came in the marked child. The light inside the house flickered as the dark moved across the floor like smoke, with weight and form and sound. That was not sound at all, just a pressure inside the chest. Like drowning without water, he stood in the center of the room with the old rifle in his hands and his feet planted like roots in the ground, and his eyes watching every corner, even the ones that had nothing inside, because the nothing felt like it was watching back. The door remained wide open, and outside the night was thicker than before, and the trees had stopped moving, and the wind was gone, and the stars had vanished, as if the sky itself had closed its eyes. He stepped forward slowly and whispered her name. The woman's name, but there was no answer, only the soft hum of something behind the walls, something old and angry and close. Then the child appeared. She was not walking, she was floating just a little above the ground, like her feet had forgotten the earth, and her eyes were open and glowing white, and her small hands reached out toward him without fear. She looked up at him and spoke, but her mouth did not move, and yet the words were inside his head like a dream that spoke first and listened second. They are inside the air, she said, and inside the shadows and inside the memories, and I can see them. All he dropped to one knee and held out his hand, and she placed her hand in his, and he felt warmth like sunlight on snow, and he saw things that were not his to see. He saw planets burning and soldiers running and towers made of glass and metal rising into skies filled with fire, and he saw the same child held in the arms of a woman who looked both human and not, and who cried without sound as machines closed, and he pulled away and gasped for breath, and the child blinked and her glow faded, and she looked tired and young and small again. The woman entered the room, her face pale and her eyes dark with fear, and she said, "The mark has awakened, and now they will come in greater numbers because they can feel her now, because the signal is alive." She showed him the child's wrist, and there it was, a mark glowing faint blue like the edge of a storm, a circle with lines and tiny runes that moved like they were alive, like they were breathing, like they were waiting. He asked what it was, and she said it was a key, not just to a place, but to a door between worlds, between species, between wars and peace and control and chaos, and the child was not just the holder, but also the lock and the door and the choice. He could not understand everything, but he knew one thing very clearly: he had to protect her. They heard a sound outside, something different from before, a hum like engines, but deeper, like something large had landed or awakened. He peeked through the window and saw lights in the sky, red and white and gold, not like stars, but like eyes looking for something, hiding from something. The woman said, "They found us, and this time they are not pretending to be human, because they know who you are, and they know you are not afraid to kill." He looked at her and asked what they wanted from the child, and she said, "Power and history and control and revenge," because the child was proof that the war had not ended, that the bloodlines had not broken, that the future still belonged to both sides. He told them to go to the cellar where the old war tools were kept and the codes were buried and the doors were thicker than memory. The woman carried the child down, and he followed with a box of old weapons and data chips and things he swore never to use again. But promises mean nothing when children are hunted like prey. As they reached the bottom of the steps, the ground shook and dust fell from the ceiling, and the lights flickered again, and the old codes flashed on the screen, green and alive and waiting for his voice. He spoke his old name, the name from before the war, and the system unlocked and showed blueprints and defense lines and energy shields that still had power. He turned to the child and asked what she needed, and she said only one thing: time to remember who she was and why she was born and what she must become. The woman looked at him and said, "She is more than a child. She is a message. She is the last word in a language that only peace can speak." He nodded and armed the system and sealed the cellar and watched on the screen as shapes began to gather outside the house, tall and wrong and silent, but deadly. The child sat in the center of the room, eyes closed, hands folded, and the mark on her wrist now pulsing like a heart, like a beacon, calling out across stars and space and silence. And he stood by the door waiting for the storm, the infiltrators. The cellar was cold and quiet, and the only light came from the soft glow on the child's wrist as she sat with her legs crossed, her back straight, her eyes closed, like someone listening to something far away, something only she could hear. The woman stood beside her, watching every breath, every twitch, every movement, like a mother watching the sunset for the last time, like someone waiting for a clock that had no hands. He stood near the console, his fingers dancing across keys older than memory, older than peace, calling up systems that once saved cities and buried armies and turned the sky red. The screen flickered and new shapes appeared outside the house, humanoid figures walking slowly, steadily, silently toward the front door, and he knew without question they were not human, even if they looked like I've whispered to the woman. And she nodded and picked up the child and moved her behind the old vault wall, where the core was thick enough to block most scans, and maybe even the ones designed for hearts that beat different. Then came the knock, not on the door this time, but on the wall itself, from the inside, from the old shaft that led to the outer fence and was sealed years ago with steel and regret. He turned with the rifle in his hands and stepped close and placed his ear against the wall, and there it was, a voice. Soft and clear, a woman's voice, familiar and wrong. "Hello, my love. I finally found you, and I need you to open the door because I am cold, and I miss you, and I am not angry anymore." He stepped back, his hands shaking just slightly, and looked at the woman who now stared at him like she had heard it too, and she whispered, "They found your memory, and they are wearing it like a coat." The voice came again, sweeter now, more desperate. "I forgave you, and I brought her back, and she wants to see you, and we can go home together and never be afraid again." He screamed and fired at the wall, and the voice vanished like mist, and the silence returned thick and heavy and final. Then the console lit red, and alarms whispered instead of screamed, and he saw it on the screen. The house had been breached, not from the door, not from the windows, but from below, from the old water lines that once carried life, but now only carried ghosts. He grabbed a sonic mine from the case and handed it to the woman, and she nodded and placed it near the vent and armed it with steady fingers, and then they waited, breathing slow, watching the small blinking light like it was a candle in a world made of oil. Child opened her eyes, and they were not white anymore. They were gold, burning gold, and she said softly, "They are not just here for me, they are here for you too, because you remember things that were not meant to be remembered." He asked what she meant, and she said, "You were part of the first project, the first test, the first door, and they never erased you completely, and now they want to finish the job." He felt something move in his chest. A memory breaking free, something with blood and wires and screams and blue lights behind his eyes, and he fell to one knee, gasping for a name that was not his. The woman ran to him and touched his shoulder and whispered his name. The new one, the real one, the one he chose after the war, and he held on to it like a raft in a storm. Then the wall burst inward, and they came tall and thin, with faces like mirrors and eyes like ink. They walked like dancers and moved like knives, and their voices were soft and full of other people's words. They said, "Give us the child, and we will let you remember without pain. Give us the child, and we will erase the war from your bones. Give us the child, and we will make you clean." He raised the rifle and said nothing. The woman stood beside him, her fists clenched, her eyes wet, and her feet bare and bleeding, but she did not move. Child stepped out from behind the vault, her golden eyes glowing and her wrist burning, and her voice louder now like thunder behind glass. "No," she said, and the walls shook. "You will not take what is mine, and you will not touch what is his, and you will not speak in the voice of the dead." The infiltrators paused, their heads tilted like machines stuck in a loop, and then one of them screamed, not with a mouth but with light, and all the glass in the cellar cracked at once. He fired the rifle, and the sonic mine exploded, and the world became nothing but sound and dust and color and motion. When the smoke cleared, the child stood alone in the center of the room, the mark now blue and steady, and her eyes calm like a storm had passed, and only truth remained. And he knew then she was not just a child, she was a weapon and a warning, and maybe, just maybe, a way out. The truth about the war. The dust still hung in the air like ash from a dead world, and the silence that followed was deep and strange, like the earth itself had stopped breathing for a moment to listen to what would happen next. The child stood in the center of the room, her hands glowing, her hair lifted slightly by a force that did not move wind, and her eyes no longer gold or silver, but shifting like light through water, never the same color. Twice the woman stepped forward slowly, her breath shaking, her voice barely strong enough to rise, but it did, and she said, "It is time for him to know, because they are not just hunting the child, they are hunting him too, and neither of us can fight this." Without truth, he stared at her, his hands still wrapped around the old weapon, his body tired, his mind spinning with fragments that did not fit but somehow felt like they belonged, like old keys in a rusted lock. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small black device, no bigger than a coin, and held it out and placed it in his palm, and he felt it heat up like a memory waking from sleep. The device projected an image in the air, a sphere of light filled with voices and faces and moments trapped in time, moments that did not belong to him, but somehow felt like they did. He saw a younger version of himself walking through metal halls, speaking with men and women in long white coats, carrying datapads covered in alien symbols mixed with human numbers and maps that led to nowhere. The woman began to speak, and her voice became stronger, as if the memories themselves were giving her power. "You were not just a soldier," she said. "You were a volunteer, part of the First Contact program, a bridge between species, chosen for your ability to adapt to pain and survive it without breaking." He watched the sphere and saw himself standing before a tall being with 6 arms and no mouth, and yet they were speaking through thought and gesture and code, and it made sense in a way language never could. "You helped them," she said, "and they helped US, and for a short time there was hope, real hope, that war would not be needed, that peace was possible, and the child you see before you is proof that it almost worked. He stepped back and leaned against the wall, his breath uneven, his heart loud in his chest, and his eyes full of stars he could not name. The child walked to him and placed her hand on his wrist, and he felt it again, that soft push inside his head, like someone brushing dust off an old book and reading it out loud for the first time. He remembered more now, not just the faces, but the emotions, the trust, the fear, the betrayal, and the final day, when everything burned and the project was shut down and everyone was told it was an attack when it was not. The truth is, they wanted her kind erased, not because they were a threat, but because they were a solution that did not need war, and without war there was no profit, no power, no control. The woman nodded as he said the words out loud, and she told him that she was one of the last handlers, one of the few who escaped with a hybrid child before the purge, before the silence, before the great forgetting. The child sat down again, her legs folded, her eyes closed, and the mark on her wrist now pulsed slowly like a heartbeat. Calm and steady and real, he looked at her and asked if she remembered the others, the ones like her, and she nodded just once and said, "Some are hidden and some are lost and some are dead, but I am still here and I can still call them home outside." The sky turned darker, not with clouds, but with ships, not from Earth, not from any government, but from those who broke the treaty and now returned to finish what they started. The console beeped and showed them a signal, a call being sent from somewhere far beneath the earth, not from the child, not from them, but from something older, something buried, something waiting. "She is not the only one they are hunting," the woman said, and she showed him a second device hidden in the wall behind the old blueprints. And it was larger, more complex, and covered in symbols that made his head ache to look at. "They built more of them," she said, "not just children, but cities and vaults and weapons, and some of them are waking up, and the war that ended was only sleeping. And the peace we had was only a lie told to quiet the pain." He held the device and felt it hum, and knew that something inside him was waking up to not just memory, but purpose, something deep and unbroken, something human and not human, both at once. He turned to the child and asked what she needed from them now, and she smiled without fear and said, "I need you to remember who you were, but fight for who you are." With that, the lights dimmed, the walls shook, and the ceiling above them opened with a sound like thunder being pulled apart. The war had never ended, it had only been waiting for its chosen to return, escape, and sacrifice. The sound from above was not thunder, not storm, not wind, but something deeper, something heavier, like metal grinding against sky, like a planet sighing before it breaks. He looked up and saw the ceiling peel back, like skin torn from bone, revealing not daylight, not stars, but fire and steel and wings that hovered without air. The ships had found them, not by signal, not by accident, but by the echo of the child's awakening, by the memory inside her bones, by the truth leaking through her veins like light through cracks in a mask. The woman ran to the control board, her fingers moving fast, her eyes locked on lines of code that danced like flames, and she whispered to herself as she worked, old prayers mixed with old systems, mixed with desperation. He grabbed the child and pulled her close, and she looked up at him with eyes now still golden, now calm, and she said, "I am not afraid, but I know what must happen." The console exploded, and sparks filled the room, and the woman screamed, but kept typing with burned hands and blood on her palms, and she shouted that the vault beneath them still worked, that the last gate was still buried, but opening. He asked what gate, and she said, "The one you never finished building, the one we started when the stars first spoke, the one only she can pass through, because she is the key and the door and the map outside." The earth began to shake, not from bombs, not from weapons, but from the engines of something ancient rising from under the roots of the forest, something long buried but never dead. They ran through the lower tunnels, past rusted doors and broken machines, and walls that still whispered names of the lost and the failed and the forgotten, and the child never looked back. She led them through turns and darkness and silence and light, and finally they reached a chamber round and deep, with walls made of stone and circuits and time itself. The mark on her wrist began to shine so bright that shadows screamed and light poured from the floor, and symbols awakened, and the gate began to open like a flower made of memory and sorrow. He turned and saw movement in the tunnel, not many, not loud, but wrong shapes, too thin, too long, with faces like mirrors that did not reflect anything at all. The Woman took a step forward, her breath steady, her hands shaking, her body tired, but her eyes full of something sharp and fierce. You take her, she said to him, and you go through the gate. And you do not stop, and you do not look back, and you do not wait for me, because I will not be coming. He said no, and she said yes, and this is how we win, not by killing, not by hiding, but by choosing who gets to see tomorrow. She pulled a device from her belt, and he recognized it at once. Not a bomb, not a shield, but something worse, something final, something that erases not just enemies, but history itself. She kissed the child on the head and said, find the others and tell them we tried, and tell them we believed, and tell them the fire did not take everything. The child cried without sound, and her tears glowed like stars falling, and she turned away and stepped through the gate and vanished into light so pure it hurt to see. He stood there 1 second longer, then ran after her, his heart screaming, his soul heavy, and just before he vanished he saw the woman raise the device and smile like someone who had finally remembered the end of a story they once loved. The light swallowed him, and then there was nothing behind. Then the chamber exploded, not with fire, not with force, but with silence. So deep it folded the air into pieces and scattered every false thing into dust far away. In a place not made of earth or sky, he landed hard and cold and alive, and the child stood beside him, holding his hand, her mark. Now dark her eyes, now quiet her voice. Small we made it, she said, and he nodded and looked up and saw the sky was not sky, but metal, and the trees were not trees, but towers, and this place was not safe, but it was not lost. He sat down and closed his eyes and whispered the woman's name, and the wind carried it away like a promise. The war was not over, but they had escaped, and sometimes escape was the only victory left to take the final choice. The air in the new world felt heavy like memory soaked in stone, like sorrow stitched into sky, and he stood with the child on ground that pulsed with old code and older blood. This was not Earth, and yet it remembered Earth. It echoed with pieces of cities and faces and voices that never belonged here, but had been brought across time and space and pain. The child walked slowly, her small feet touching the metal soil, and everywhere she stepped the ground lit up with shapes and letters he could not read, but somehow felt in his chest like a song played backwards through a storm. He followed her through quiet towers and broken gates and halls filled with statues that looked like both men and machines, as if this place had once belonged to peace and war at the same time. They came to a chamber high and vast with no ceiling, and in the center was a throne made of light and stone and breath, and beside it stood a being taller than thought and older than stars. Its eyes were not eyes, but windows into long histories, into forgotten battles, into moments that never ended, and it spoke without voice, and yet every word echoed through their bones. You have brought her, and now you must choose. He asked what choice, and the being raised a hand, and the world shifted, and he saw visions carved in fire and shadow. He saw the child growing older, her power spreading, her mind expanding, her heart full of hope and sorrow and joy and fear, and she led both humans and hybrids to peace, to unity, to something new, something fragile and beautiful. Then he saw another path, where the child was taken by force by those who feared her, and she was turned into a weapon, into a storm, into the very thing she was born to stop. And the stars fell, and no one remembered that being said, she is not only a child, she is a seed, and what grows depends on the ground and the hand and the sun, and now she must choose where to grow. The child looked at him, and her eyes were quiet like oceans before storms, and she asked softly, should I go back? Should I try to save the place that broke me before I even breathed? He wanted to say yes, and he wanted to say no, and he wanted to protect her forever, but he also knew that protection without choice was just another cage. He said, you choose not because you must, but because you can, because they tried to take that from you, and I will not. The child turned to the throne and placed her hand on it, and the ground cracked and light rose, and the towers began to hum, and the air filled with voices from every corner of forgotten time. She said, I will not return to be a weapon, but I will not hide to be safe. I will speak, and they will hear, and those who listen will follow, and those who do not will try to stop me, and I will walk anyway. The being stepped back and vanished into air, and the throne became a gate not like the last one, but wider, older, open to all directions, and behind it were ships and faces and possibilities. He looked at her and asked, what now? And she said, now I speak, And then I walk, and then I wait, and then I rise. They walked through the gate, and the world changed again, and they were above. Earth not in orbit, but in something larger than orbit, something outside time, and from there the child reached out. With her voice, not words, not sounds, just truth across planets, across minds, across barriers. Built from fear, her voice moved, and those who had waited felt it, and those who had hunted felt it, and all of them paused. The world below did not fall, and it did not rise, but it listened, and for the first time in forever something truly listened. He sat beside her on the edge of the light and looked down at the blue world turning. And he thought of the woman who stayed behind, and he thought of the boy he used to be, and he thought of war and fire and silence. The child held his hand and whispered, "We are not finished," and he smiled with eyes full of storms and said, "No, we are only beginning." And behind them a new sun rose, without heat, without shadow, just a sun made of choice and breath and what comes next.